Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the second album from the Prodigy, Music for the Jilted Generation. Alright, so we've come off the heels of the Prodigy's debut Experience, which had all the classic singles that have become definitive of that 90s UK rave era, and pioneered and popularized the whole hardcore breakbeat style breaking out at the time. As big a classic as that album is considered today, though, I don't think it's necessarily the kind of sound that most people first think about when they think of the Prodigy. It was actually their lowest ever charting album in the UK, which seems kind of crazy to think about right now. Fast forward to 1994 though, now that they've been well established as national hit makers, it's time for a bit of a change in sound, which might be more indicative of this band's actual reputation we know today. The ingredients going into their style are still mostly the same. A lot of big heavy breakbeats, acid, sped up sample mashups, and other standard 90s rave cliches, but there's a noticeably darker edge to the material on this sophomore effort. A lot more rock and hip-hop influences that really set it apart from their contemporaries on the scene. Also, since it was 1994, that was right around the same time that the UK government was starting to actively crack down on the very scene that they came up in. The ever-infamous Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 was in the middle of being passed, which criminalized rave parties and allowed the police to forcibly shut down public gatherings of people playing loud music with repetitive beats. The conservative elites of the time were considering these raves some kind of active danger to the public or a sign of moral degeneracy of the youth or some bullshit like that. And obviously many different protests broke out in response. I've already talked about a number of projects made in protest of this specific law in the past, such as Outtaker's Anti-EP or Orbital Snivelization. But the Prodigy's response wasn't so much about making sarcastic commentary on the wording of the law itself, like Outtaker did, or loosely examining the ills of modern capitalist society as a whole, like Orbital did, but rather lean into that image those conservative elites seem to have of their scene. Bring in tracks about poison and voodoo and breaking and entering and doing drugs, scary shit. Get really hedonistic and aggressive, hold up their middle fingers to the system, cracking down on their lifestyle and give further credence to that image of rave music being dangerous and rebellious in such a way that nobody else on that scene was really even trying to do in the same way at the time. The ethos and mission of the album can be pretty easily summed up by the famous Les Edwards illustration that came packaged with it. Like, it shows a canyon that on one side has this army of all the big bad police who want to shut down the raves, and on the other side, there's an outdoor rave, surrounded by all the peaceful green grass and sunlight, and then there's like a bridge connecting the two, which is being cut down by a long-haired raver who is giving the cops the middle finger. I mean, it's a bit on the nose, but it feels salient for the time. And of course, it was only inevitable that this new image of youthful rebelliousness only made the Prodigy even cooler to the fellow young folk of the time and allowed them to see an even greater level of popularity than they'd ever seen before, even bringing in audiences who might not have given them the time of day previously, who had more of those rock or hip-hop backgrounds. Well, not to quite the extent of a jump in audience that their next album would bring them, but a noticeable jump nonetheless. The album charted much better than Experience in several different countries, went to #1 in the UK, was their first to do that, and as all of their other later albums would do as well. And even started to make the smallest of crossovers over here in the US, just barely charting on the Billboard 200 at the time. Now, one could look at an album like this and maybe find it to feel a little strange to look back on 30 years later. You could say, it's a little funny to think of 90s Gen Xers trying to call themselves the Jilted Generation after the past couple of decades of political strife and multiple economic downturns that have come after the 90s, and after a non-unsubstantial chunk of that very generation ended up siding with the ruling class and decrying people advocating for systemic change as stupid and wasting their time. Heck, even Liam Howlett himself has purportedly tried to walk back this album's politics in more recent years, deriding the title as stupid and saying it was never meant to be a political statement in the first place. Which is obviously complete horseshit to be saying about the album that has fuck 'em and their law on it. It is true that the political subtext of this album is very shallow at best. It pretty much ends at a fairly vague anti-establishment attitude carrying through everything. There's no actual societal introspection going on here in the text of the album, and there's really only one track here that has anything resembling an explicit political message, with everything else doing more to set up this darker and more dangerous mood than any kind of commentary of actual substance. However, as the saying goes, all art is political, informed by or responding to the values of the time you live in, and that is very hard to ignore in this specific case, which so clearly took some inspiration from this one specific societal injustice that was going down in the UK at the time. And regardless of what Howlett might say now, I'd argue can still hit effectively in that way and feel salient to this day. Police shutting down raves at the time was an obviously bullshit thing that warranted this kind of angrier rave music being made in protest, and would still feel warranted if that were still happening right now. And tying the music to that cause of fuck the system, even in the tenuous way that it does, makes all the violent and dangerous edges to the album feel that much more righteous and gives it proper stakes in a way that none of the Prodigy's other albums really tried to do. It's still very much an album that gets you in the mood to fight the powers that be. And regardless of how seriously you want to take the politics, there's no denying that the album is just made out of wall-to-wall bangers. Right from the way this project starts, with the quick 30-second intro about some narrator wanting to take their work back underground so that it doesn't fall in the wrong hands, leading into the opener Break and Enter, which really sets the tone for what you're going to get on this album, and how it progresses all the sounds explored on their debut into this darker and edgier territory. You got the same familiar breakbeats and 90s synth pads and melodic acid breakdowns, but you also got this really thick and heavy buzzing bass line. You got the minor key vocal sample, which conveys more of a sense of active urgency than anything on their debut. You even got all these sound effects of breaking glass. It can be just as much turn your brain off fun as anything on their last album and goes just as hard, but there's again a real sense of stakes here that wasn't here before, like shit is just really starting to get real. And that leads right into Their Law, featuring Pop Will Eat Itself, our above-mentioned political track. The hook is literally, fuck 'em and their law, clearly meant as this righteous middle finger to those using the law as a tool of oppression. There's really no other way to interpret that. And it fucking slaps. On top of that, it's also the first time we hear the band start to incorporate obvious rock and metal influences into their sound, with a lot of chugging guitar riffs underscoring the usual mix of breakbeats and squawking synth blips. It's a very simple track, but it hits in such a way that nobody can deny, and even if it is the only explicitly political track the band ever put out, it feels like such an integral part of the album that gets it to work on the level that it does. Now, that's not to say every track here adds something integral to the experience. Following track Full Throttle is admittedly a little more of a fillerish track in context, that doesn't add something unique that other tracks here couldn't already. Though it is still a definite banger, with more fast-paced beat work going up next to squirting bass and a few theatrical MIDI piano breakdowns. But that track is immediately topped by the ever-classic Voodoo People, quite possibly the single hardest-hitting track on an album already full of hard-hitting bangers. The beats just have so much visceral propulsion to them, and the way they go up against all the chopped-up and aggressive guitar riffs, weird processed maybe flute riffs, and unstable violin sound effects. And of course that core synth line that blares through the middle and acts as the hook. There's really nothing that need be said about a track like this besides just reaffirming how hard it goes and looking at the fact that artists like the Chemical Brothers and later Pendulum set aside time to put their own spins on it for remixes. And this track blends quite seamlessly into the following track, Speedway, theme from Fastlane. As far as I can tell, that track's subtitle isn't actually a reference to any other existing media property. It wasn't commissioned to be the theme for any movie or video game or anything like that I know of, and when I looked through the Prodigy's credits on IMDb, I didn't even see an example of it having been licensed out after the fact. But it does feel like it would slot very easily into such a context, just a track that predictably hits on that kind of frantic racing energy, with the usual propulsive beats and squelching acid and bright rave stabs. It's the track that makes you feel like you're behind the wheel of a race car or something. Could very easily picture it showing up in the soundtrack to, like, one of the Wipeout games, for example. It's also the longest track on the album at nearly 9 minutes long, though the core of the track is only about 6 minutes, and it bleeds into a nice little ambient outro for the rest of it, with all these whooshing synth pads coming in waves that still maintain a little bit of that tense, kind of frantic energy in that part anyway. Next we got The Heat, The Energy, which is a track I often don't even notice exists. It kind of blends right into the previous track without really doing much to set itself apart in context. Again, still goes as hard as everything else here with a stabbing bass line and little soul singer sample going over the usual banging beats. It's not a track I would skip, but I did mark it as my least favorite here on the merits of being the most forgettable track on the album for me. But after that, we finally get a new little left hook in a hip-hop oriented track called Poison. One of the most big beat type tracks in their repertoire, featuring blaring, not really acid synths going over samples of someone imitating a crow and a slow down amen break next to other more standard hip-hop breaks. And this track is, of course, also notable for being the only track here to feature contributions from a full-time band member who isn't Liam Howlett. Maxim Reality returns to rap the somewhat repetitive hook and, get pitched up slightly. I kinda like how his voice is offset by half a beat in different parts of the track, which sort of gives off the illusion of the rhythm changing when it hasn't. I got the poison, I got the remedy, versus I got the poison, I got the remedy. It's the same thing, but it feels different. So that's a cool effect. Next we get the album's biggest hit, No Good, Start the Dance. This wasn't a track I was sure would be a favorite when I gave it my first return listen for this video, as the mix of the electric bass loops and fuzzy melodic rave stabs didn't seem all that unique in context and didn't sound the most pleasant. But then the sampled hook came in and all the good memories came flooding back. You're no good for me, I don't need nobody. Another one of those tracks that could probably most easily fit in the context of their debut, if not for how minor key the melodies are and how it kind of gives off that same tense and on-edge energy that something like Break and Enter also had. And speaking of tracks that feel like they could fit on their last album, we then get the album's lead single, One Love, which is probably the one track on this album that actually sits the most tonally in line with their debut, without the darker edges the rest of the album focuses on. Most characterized by a lot of 90s synth organs and a repeating sample of, some Middle Eastern singer. I admittedly went back and forth on whether I wanted to mark this track as my least favorite, purely because of the way the track ends in an anticlimax fade-out before it gets the chance to see itself out naturally. See, when putting this album together, Liam Howlett realized that he'd accidentally ended up with too much music to fit on a single CD, so he had to edit this track down in order to fit the format, and he did so in a pretty lazy fashion. He's since gone on to say that the album probably would have been better had this track in Full Throttle been cut out of the album altogether, and I can't say I entirely disagree with him on that front. Also, the lead sample on this one is that if I'm not in the right mood, that one can get a little annoying. Though, honestly, despite all that and the abrupt fade out and whatever, this is still a solid classic rave track that adds a bit more, positive energy and tonal variety to an album that definitely benefits from having it. So I think I can still give it a pass. And that finally leads us to the album's ending, a run of 3 tracks collectively called The Narcotic Suite. When I first heard this album in high school, this section at the end was always the stretch of the album that stood out to me the most as my favorite part. And the opening of this suite, 3 Kilos, is by some distance the track from this album I have probably listened to the most frequently. I don't know if I'd say it runs away as my favorite track by such a big distance nowadays, but it's clear why teenager me was drawn to it, as it's this sudden break from all the bright flashy beats and edgy and dark atmosphere for this kind of grooving and offbeat down-tempo cut, building itself around this mildly jazzy and funky Bernard Purdie sample with these guitars and pianos bouncing off each other next to all these bubbling sound effects, because it's about making drugs, I guess. And these intensely buzzing bass lines, and there's even some live flute solos, care of Phil Bent. There is absolutely nothing in the Prodigy's catalog that sounds even remotely like 3 Kilos, and it always so starkly stuck out to me like a sore thumb in that way. I also always loved the suite's second movement, Skylined. This track may not be quite as big a change of pace from the rest of the album, and returns to more of the typical rave-heavy sound palette everything else focuses on, but it still creates one of the most expansive and cinematic mixes out of those sounds, with all these really dramatic pad progressions going up next to all the wobbling beat work, still maintaining a bit of the odder and comparatively more toned-down experimentalism of this little narcotic suite. The final movement of the suite and album closer, Claustrophobic Sting, was always my least favorite of this little trilogy. It focuses on a much more straightforward acid techno sound that puts it more in line with other tracks here like Voodoo People without going as out of the box as the previous 2 tracks. But I have definitely come around on this one a lot more recently. The track does predictably go really hard. The heaviness of the percussion here is honestly up there with Voodoo People, as among the hardest hitting on display. The acid breakdowns stick more to that just classic TB303 sound than any other track here. The whispering samples of "My mind is glowing" is definitely one of the catchier and more memorable samples, and all the sound effects of screaming and alarm bells really amp up the intensity too. Even if it makes for more of like a frightening and unstable finish to the album, it still makes for a climactic finish as well. Very odd way to go out, but it works well enough. So yeah, that's finally everything on music for the Jilted generation. Now, on a personal level, I'm not going to tell you that this album works better for me than Experience. The more lighthearted and fun tone of their debut and the way it pioneered all those 90s rave cliches and hit you with new catchy hooks every minute, that album just plays more to my personal taste than this album, which both lets these tracks meander on longer but also weirdly doesn't feel quite as dense on the ideas front, like it's just kind of sonically sparser without as much going on. Not to mention, Music for the Jilted Generation is just a very long album. It's almost 80 minutes total, and I do always feel that length. I may personally be more of a proponent of this exact kind of album structure from the CD era than most, and there definitely exist albums from this era which do a far worse job of justifying their lengths. I don't think this album's length is such an issue where I feel like it's in dire need of editing, and every track is at least solid. But I don't get the sense that this album absolutely needed to stretch on as long as it did, and maybe cutting a track or two probably wouldn't hurt. Though at the same time, I imagine I'm going to see just as many people who do see this as the true height of their career and like a perfect 10 out of 10 and everything. Not just those who, unlike myself, were actually there at the time and place of its release and likely saw it as exactly the generational anti-establishment rallying cry as it was originally intended to be, but also those who want to see this band at their most purposeful, driven, and ambitious, delivering material at their artistic heights while also banging just as hard as they always do. I may not personally see this as like an absolutely perfect masterwork, but I do see it as a classic and an essential listen, both for historical purposes and for the fact that it's just an all-around really fun time that's aged remarkably well. And as such, I'm feeling a strong 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.